Welcome, everyone. Tell us where you're from. Oh. We always wonder when we change the timing a little bit whether it's going to encourage people from other time zones to join us.
Mm-hmm. Well, we have a lot of West Coast people still, and there's someone from Brasilia.
And Sydney.
Oh, wow.
Oh.
Yeah.
I just laughed at merely Greensboro, North Carolina. That's still very good.
Is anyone having snow in your location?
What's snow?
What's snow? Is that you said, Susan?
Oh, I thought you said snow. There was a glitch in the sound. So
Oh,
I thought it was some combo of something or other.
all right. Are we ready to start? Or should we give it a couple more minutes?
Well, are people still getting on?
I've seen people trickle in, maybe another minute or something.
My brother's over in Colorado right now, and he said that it was about 2 feet of snow.
Mm-hmm.
He lives in Zurich, and he hasn't seen that much snow in ages. So,
Wow.
it's pretty interesting weather going on.
It was 75 degrees here, so that's kind of hard to imagine.
And where's here? Sarah, tell us.
Oh, West Virginia, and I saw another person in the comments, fellow West Virginian.
Mm-hmm.
And I see a lot of names of people that we saw at the AGM quite recently here.
That's true.
No snow in Pennsylvania. People are still harvesting tomatoes. Wow.
Good.
Yeah.
Whose keyboard is that? Let's see.
Probably mine, or I don't know.
Yeah, it probably is. It's not mine. Well, I think we must be ready now.
Yeah, let's get started. Okay. Well, welcome everybody. My name is Inga Brody. I'm one of the directors of Jane Austen and Company and Jane Austen Summer Program. And I'm joined by my fellow hosts tonight, Susan Ellen Ford, Sarah Walton, and our wonderful technical director, Nadea Pugh. And we've been trying to provide at Jane Austen and Company some top-notch programming related to Jane Austen in lots of different ways. Since 2019, we've been virtual. We've been but synchronous, both synchronous and asynchronous. Tonight, we're continuing our series on Austen and the Brontes, which we began earlier this year, and which is going to continue to the end of 2024.
Yeah, and before tonight's talk from Claire O'Callaghan, we want to highlight 2 of the upcoming talks that will follow tonight's event, and you can see that on the poster on the screen. So we have events on November 19th, featuring our own Deb Barnum, and on December 3rd, featuring Maria Frawley. And we hope to have one additional event on the horizon. So we're excited to conclude 2024 with this amazing lineup of speakers.
Please visit our website to get more information about the entire slate of speakers for this series and others. Our website is janeaustenandco.org. Our next event, as Sarah said, on November 19th is going to feature Deb Barnum presenting on illustrated editions of Jane Eyre. And this talk is going to be a visual journey through several of the illustrated editions of Bronte's novel, beginning in 1872, 15 years after Jane Eyre's original publication. The different ways the artists portray particular scenes or characters in the novel, and why some of these illustrations might work better than others. And Deb is also going to compare the work of Bronte's illustrators to that of artists who took on Jane Austen's novels.
And we've tried, where possible, to get grants from various public humanities organizations to keep our program going. And the beginning of the Austen and the Bronte series was made possible by the North Carolina Humanities, statewide nonprofit, and the state affiliate of the National Endowment of the Humanities.
All right, well, now I am excited to introduce tonight's speaker. So Dr. Claire O'Callaghan is a senior lecturer in Victorian literature at Loughborough University. Claire's research focuses on the Brontes, and she has published widely on their lives and works, including the short public history book Emily Bronte Reappraised from 2018, published for Emily's bicentenary. Claire's recent research focuses on the Brontes' letters and health. She's also working with the Bronte Parsonage Museum on the transcription and publication of Charlotte Bronte's Parisian Little Book, a missing piece in her known juvenilia. Claire is editor-in-chief of Bronte Studies, which is the official academic journal of the Bronte Society.
Before Claire begins her talk, which should last about 45 minutes, our technical director, Nadea, is going to explain how you can send in questions during and after the talk.
Thanks, Susan. Hi everybody. Welcome to the stream. We're really excited to have you here. A lot of you probably already know how this works, but just in case you don't, you can leave comments and questions by posting in the sidebar, and we'll collect those comments throughout the presentation and then ask them during the Q&A at the end. You do need a YouTube or Google account to post in that sidebar, but if you don't have one of those, that's okay as well. And you can just email us at info@janeaustenandco.org, and we'll collect your comments and questions there, and then ask them for you in the chat. But yeah, please comment, please share your thoughts. Our speakers love to hear from you. So yeah.
All right, and now without further ado, we present Dr. Claire O'Callaghan and her talk entitled, I Have Lost a Treasure, Such a Sister, Sisters, Sickness, Letters, and Grief.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much to Eric, Susan, Sarah, Inga for the invitation. It's really, really lovely to be here, to be talking to you, and really exciting to see where so many of you have come from. It's a real pleasure. Thank you so much. And a big thank you in advance to Nadea for all the technical support and for moving my slides forward. Thank you so much. I'm going to be talking, as the title indicates, about a couple of things that are sensitive topics. I'm talking about sickness, I'm talking about death, I'm talking about grief, all of which are things that many of us who have lived through the pandemic in recent years have been close to in one way or another. So oh, can you hear me? Sorry, I seem to have dropped there. Can someone just check that they can hear me? Yes, brilliant. Sorry about that. I went blank here completely. So the other thing I was just about to say in terms of trigger is that this is obviously a talk about real life people. So I'm going to be referring to novels and other things during it, but this is mostly about real life figures, about Emily Bronte, Charlotte Bronte, but I'm going to start with Jane Austen and her sister. And as many of you will have noted, the quotation that leads my talk today is from Cassandra Austen's letter to Fanny Knight that was written on July the 18th, 1817, which is the day her sister Jane died. And in that letter, Cassandra wrote incredibly movingly of her sister's final days and of Jane's struggle with the mysterious illness that killed her. And she also writes of her own feelings, her very raw feelings in the immediacy of her sister's death. So, acknowledging that she was by then hopeless of any prospect for Jane's recovery, Cassandra wrote, quote, "I had no suspicion how rapidly my loss was approaching," unquote. Next slide, please. But she moves herself aside very quickly to pay tribute to her beloved sister Jane. And this is what she writes. "I have lost a treasure, such a sister, such a friend as never can have been surpassed. She was the sun of my life, the gilder of every pleasure, the soother of every sorrow. I had not a thought concealed from her, and it is as if I had lost a part of myself." Now, this brief but very powerful sentence captures the fullness of the loving sisterly bond between Cassandra and Jane. And many have written about this, written about how close they were, so close, in fact, that as Cassandra implies here, they were almost an extension of one another in some way. They were sisters, they were friends, they were confidants, they were comrades, they were family. Cassandra had been with Jane in Winchester in the week before she died, or in the weeks before she died, and they'd moved into lodgings so as to be near Mr. Lyford, the physician who had been treating Jane and whose advice Jane trusted. Mary Austen had also arrived to help nurse her sister-in-law. Now, as many of you will know, just a few days before Jane's death, she had been dictating 24 lines of comic verse to Cassandra, verses that imagined St. Swithin as placing a curse on the annual Winchester races that were also happening at that time. But in the last few days, Cassandra noticed a change in Jane. She described it as a visible change. And she noticed the fact that Jane was sleeping heavier and sleeping a lot more than she normally would. She'd had a seizure of some kind, and a doctor came in and administered her with something, most likely laudanum, to ease her discomfort. And on the day of her death, particularly in the last half hour before she passed, again, as many of you will know, Cassandra wrote that Jane knew she was dying. Quote, "She became tranquil and unconscious." Cassandra explained that when she asked Jane if there was anything that she wanted, quote, her answer was that she wanted nothing but death. And some of her words were, "God grant me patience, pray for me, oh, pray for me," end quote. Cassandra sat with her in those final hours, stepping away only for a brief period of time when Mary took her place. But Cassandra was there at the last. And after Jane had died, Cassandra said that she was able to close her eyes herself. And it was a great gratification to Cassandra to be able to render her these last services, as she called it. As Jane's body lay in an open coffin in the rooms they shared in College Street, Cassandra cut several locks of her sister's hair that she kept and some to give away. And Jane Austen was then laid to rest on the 24th of July. Now, my account of Jane's final days and of Cassandra's experience of sibling loss is very short, but it is a really useful starting point, I think, for me to then open up to think about a connection to the Brontes and the work I've been doing in recent years on sickness, on letters, and particularly on the final months of Emily Bronte and more recently on Anne. And we can see in Cassandra's words that she loved and respected her sister enormously. And we know that the feeling was mutual because really, with the exception of two very small legacies, Jane left everything she possessed to Cassandra. And Cassandra, despite her grief, went on to act as Jane's executor. And a few months after her death, of course, we see the publication of some of those novels that came out. So I want to show how just from that very, very short vignette, there are some remarkable connections to the Brontes. Next slide, please. As is well known, Charlotte Bronte on the left here was no fan of Jane Austen's published writing. She was really angry with George Henry Lewes for telling her, quote, that she must learn to acknowledge Austen as one of the greatest artists, one of the greatest painters of human character, end quote. But in Charlotte's correspondence in those final months of 1848 and through 1849, we can find a connection between the Bronte sisters and Austen. Charlotte, like Cassandra, was in the position of being the older sibling, watching a younger sister's experience of ill health. They were experiencing the same emotional pain from watching their sisters deteriorate and pass away. And for Charlotte Bronte, in fact, that her experience was acute across 1848 and 49 because she lost 3 siblings in a 9-month period. She lost her brother Branwell in September 1848. Emily, her sister, dies in December 1848. And then Anne passes in May 1849. So it was a really incredibly difficult time for her. Like Cassandra, Charlotte also had to deal with her sister's literary estate in both of them in some way or another. And I'll come back to that towards the end of my talk. And although the sisters had intense bonds, when it comes to Charlotte and Emily, as I'm going to show you, things were a little bit more complex. Next slide, please. I'm going to suggest if we look at some of the writing from the period 1849, so the letters, Charlotte's novel Shirley, although we find some evidence of tension, rivalry and friction between Charlotte and Emily, particularly around Emily's experience of ill health, we can see through these other materials that Charlotte wrote, and including a poem that I'm going to share with you as well, that Charlotte Bronte loved her sister very deeply, and that Emily, despite her kind of unusual behaviour, also loved her sister. But I want to show how in these written materials we can see how Charlotte used writing to celebrate her sister and to memorialise her. And you may wonder why I'm going to focus very much on Charlotte's account of this, why I'm only giving a one-sided view. And the answer to that is very simple. We don't have the archival materials to elucidate really anything by Emily in her own voice. There are no letters about her experience of tuberculosis. We've only got Charlotte's account to work through. And in the absence of anything from Emily by Emily, scholars and biographers writing about this have often been quite cruel about Emily, particularly in assessing her behaviour in these final months. So I'm going to hopefully try to challenge some of that and to foreground the fact that this is a young woman who is dying. And I'm going to show hopefully that actually she really did understand that she was dying. And although her behaviour might seem a little bit strange, we might be able to recalibrate our thinking and see that perhaps she was thinking about her sister's feelings. Next slide, please. So in context, just before this period in 1848, 2 years earlier in 1846, Charlotte Bronte had led the publication on the left here of poems by Currer, Ellis and Acton Bell, which is the Bronte pseudonyms, as I'm sure you all know, a collaborative book of poetry by the sisters. It was a commercial flop. It's selling only 2 copies. And as history tells us, realising that they weren't going to make careers as poets and needing some financial security, Charlotte, Emily and Anne Bronte turned their hand to novels. Charlotte drafted The Professor, Anne produced Agnes Grey, and Emily wrote Wuthering Heights. Charlotte's book failed to get interest from a literary publisher, so she put it aside, very, very quickly wrote Jane Eyre. And so it came to be that in 1847, the 3 Bell brothers published their debut novels, Currer Bell's Jane Eyre, Acton Bell's Agnes Grey, and Ellis Bell's Wuthering Heights. And these books, again, as you will know, were accused of being coarse, of being immoral and vulgar. And the women in particular, as readers, were discouraged from looking at them. Next slide, please. But despite these publishing achievements, the following year would bring a lot of sickness and devastation to the household. And it's the beginning, really, of a real high followed by a real low. Sickness and death visited the Howard parsonage and began a domino-like effect that would turn a family of 5 into a family of 2. So on this slide, you can see the famous picture, the pillar portrait by Branwell Bronte, so named because of the gold pillar in the centre. And you can see in the middle of my slide a portrait of Branwell by himself. And on the very right-hand side is Patrick Bronte, their father. So by the end of this period, it's just Charlotte and Patrick Bronte that are left. So Branwell Bronte, the sisters' only brother, had fallen ill during the summer of 1848. It's said that he had begun suffering what was called delirium tremens, so withdrawal effects produced by prolonged alcohol misuse and then sharp withdrawal. And he became very poorly, passing away at home on September the 24th. Now, his course of death was officially recorded as chronic bronchitis or marasmus, but several critics have argued otherwise, declaring that he most likely died of tuberculosis. And we know that Emily and Anne did suffer from tuberculosis, and it's that ultimately kills them. Now, within weeks of Branwell's death, Emily became visibly symptomatic with tuberculosis, or consumption as it was then called, and that happens in the October. Now, between the 9th of October and the day of Emily's death, which was the 19th of December in 1848, Charlotte Bronte wrote a series of letters that show and document Emily's decline, her failing health. And in that correspondence across that very short 3 months, it indicates that Charlotte sought to persuade Emily to permit all kinds of medical evaluation and therapeutic intervention, but that Emily consistently refused all of Charlotte's recommendations. Emily was completely unlike Jane Austen in that respect. She was not going to be nursed by her older sister. In fact, from only a mild aperient and a product called Lowcock's cough wafers, which was a product that was advertised as giving a relief and a bit of a cure for things like asthma and coughs and lung disorders, Charlotte's letters show that Emily rejected all other forms of medical intervention, dismissing at least one, which was homeopathy, as a form of quackery, and she declared that, quote, no poisoning doctor would come near her. So only a very short time after the visible onset of symptoms, Emily dies at home. So next slide, please. So in this correspondence, it's written to 3 recipients, but there's about 14 letters through these different 3 individuals. The first is Ellen Nussey, pictured on the left, their close friend. And then their publishers, George Smith and William Smith Williams. So every time I'm referring to a letter here, it's to one of these 3 individuals. But there's one other document. Next slide, please. And these letters are supplemented by what's been called a statement rather than a letter that Charlotte wrote to a London physician, this gentleman. He was a phrenologist and homeopath, Dr. John Eapes. And she wrote this document to him on the 9th of December. She preserved Emily's anonymity, but in writing to this doctor, Charlotte was asking Dr. Eapes for medical aid. And in fact, the document begins with the statement, quote, if Dr. Eapes can, from what has been stated, give an opinion on the case and prescribe a course of treatment, he will greatly oblige the patient's friends. Next slide, please. So as the eldest surviving sibling in a motherless family, Charlotte Bronte had since her childhood days been placed in the inevitable position of responsibility towards her younger sisters. Emily and Anne had bonded like twins, as one observer put it. And as teenagers, the sisters had been at home together and shared their daily routine. They normally had 3 hours of lessons in the morning, including drawing there together, followed by walks on the moors in the afternoon. Next slide, please. And this is a picture of the Haworth Moors today. This is my view when I walk the dog every day. I'm very, very lucky. And they walked often to their favourite destination, which is far off in the distance here. And very far in the distance here is also Top Withens. That's the inspiration for, or said to be the inspiration for, Wuthering Heights. But they were often said to walk to a place called the Meeting of the Waters, a place where the water from Oxenhope Edge runs into South Dean Beck. And Charlotte described that and this moorland that surrounds this walk, quote, as being in miles and miles of heather, a glorious blue sky and a brightening sun. There was always a lingering delight in these spots. Every moss, every flower, every tint and form was noted and enjoyed. The sisters often stayed out together until dinner time, after which they read or wrote together. And again, you'll hopefully be familiar with the idea that they wrote together in the evening and they often walked around the table, reading out passages of their prose to one another or their poetry. Next slide, please. So the letters I'm referring to describe many of the symptoms that you'd expect a tuberculosis patient to begin suffering. And it documents, as I've said, Emily's deterioration. So in early October, we're told that Emily has a cold and a cough. Next slide, please. But by the end of October, Charlotte explains that Emily had begun to worsen. And she says, quote, her cold and cough are very obstinate. I fear she has pain in the chest. And I sometimes catch a shortness in her breathing when she is moved at all quickly. She looks very, very thin and pale. By early November, Emily had deteriorated even further. And although no doctor had been consulted at this point, in her letters, Charlotte, who was very astute when it came to medicine, offers her own diagnosis. She calls it a slow inflammation of the lungs, which really tells us that she understood the symptoms of tuberculosis. And again, she'd seen this in the village and experienced this with her older sisters as well in childhood. From this point onwards, the letters detail the hastening of Emily's sickness. Her cough refused to abate, the breathing difficulties continued, and her physical pain began to increase. And Emily became emaciated, which is common with consumption. That's why, obviously, it's called consumption. It's eating the body from the inside. Next slide, please. So in December, Charlotte wrote that Emily had developed diarrhea 2 weeks prior. Now, according to the father's copy of Graham's Modern Medicine, which is this book here, and you can see Patrick Bronte's annotations on the left-hand side. This is held in the Bronte Parsonage Museum. This book indicates that once a tuberculosis patient gets diarrhea, it's one of the final stages of the disease, at least in the 19th century. Of course, we have treatments for this today. It's not a killer in the same way, certainly not in the modern Western world. But in the statement to Dr. Reeps, Charlotte revealed that Emily was sleeping well, but she was disturbed by her cough. And she also reports on her pulse. So she's quite intensively monitoring the situation as a kind of doctor, as a kind of nurse almost. So the letters then show that, as I've said, Charlotte kind of recognised this as tuberculosis, and she's clearly consumed with worry and anxiety about Emily's health. In fact, looking at these letters afresh, as I have done in the last couple of years, these narratives are really very easily documented or kind of maybe conceptualized as both narratives of sisterhood, but also letters of pain that capture Charlotte Bronte's anguish during Emily's sickness. So on the 29th of October, Charlotte wrote that she felt uneasy about the situation. And just a few days later, on the 2nd of November, she wrote very poignantly, quote, "When Emily is ill, there seems to be no sunshine in the world for me." And that turn of phrase makes me think back to Cassandra Austen's word that Jane was the sun of her life. And of course, as you can imagine, Charlotte went on to write that the family's position was exquisitely painful during this time, particularly because, as I've said, this is happening in the wake of Branwell's death. But alongside this kind of expression of suffering, these letters also document a tension between the siblings around Charlotte's anxiety about the nature and prognosis of Emily's tuberculosis and Emily's refusal of aid, which ultimately means that Charlotte is situated as a bystander in this situation. And as much as Charlotte expresses concern and pity for Emily, her letters also begin to express irritation towards her sister for Emily's refusal to comply with Charlotte's requests. In a pretty much acerbic tone on the 29th of October, Charlotte wrote to Ellen Nussey and said, quote, "Emily's reserved nature occasions one great uneasiness of mind. It's useless to question her. You get no answers. It is still more useless to recommend remedies. They are never adopted." End quote. Next slide, please. Similarly, this is a letter to William Smith Williams that's dated 22nd of November, in which Charlotte expresses complete frustration with Emily. She's obviously written to William Smith Williams, he's clued into the situation, and he's also kind of given advice to Charlotte. So Charlotte writes, "I put your most friendly letter into Emily's hands as soon as I had myself perused it, taking care, however, not to say a word in favour of homeopathy. That would not have answered. It is best, usually, to leave her to form her own judgment, and especially not to advocate the side you wish her to favour. If you do, she is sure to lean into the opposite direction, and 10 to 1 will argue herself into non-compliance. Hitherto, she has refused medicine, rejected medical advice. No reasoning, no entreaty has available to induce to see a physician. After reading your letter, she said, 'Mr. Williams' intention was kind and good, but he was under a delusion. Homeopathy was only another form of quackery.' Yet she may reconsider this opinion and come to a different conclusion. Her second thoughts are often her best." So we can see here that Charlotte really feels thwarted by this repeated closure by Emily of all her suggestions for any kind of remedy. But her words equally reveal her own kind of manipulative response. She's aware that Emily, as the sufferer, the patient in this situation, is receiving her repeated questions and all of Charlotte's recommendations as both pressure and a provocation. Next slide, please. So in many ways, the sibling bond has morphed into a power struggle over Emily's final months, a power struggle that centres on different approaches to illness and treatment. it is, as I've kind of called it, already a nurse-patient dynamic, with Charlotte forcibly situating Emily as her patient and Charlotte herself in the role of nurse. And in this respect, it's easy to read these letters as Charlotte showing Emily kind of misbehaving. She's an incredibly recalcitrant patient. And it's apt, therefore, that in the letters we find evidence of Charlotte outlining what she perceives as Emily's misbehaviour. It really bothers her, for example, that Emily insists on maintaining her daily routines and her habits. In the statement I referred to, the one to Dr. Eaps earlier, Charlotte lamented that not only had Emily refused to lie in bed for a single day, but that she insisted on sitting up from 7 a.m. until 10 p.m. Likewise, Charlotte complained to William Smith Williams that not one of her ordinary avocations will she voluntarily renounce. These ordinary avocations that Charlotte's referring to are actually Emily's insistence on feeding her dogs, her own dog Keeper, and also Anne's dog Flossie, which she insisted to do right up until the day of her death and on the morning of her death. But the letter therefore really shows that for Charlotte, it's when Emily is ill, these ordinary avocations are extraordinary avocations, and that Emily shouldn't be doing them because for Charlotte, she's too sick to be doing them at all. Now, all of this is understandable, as Emily's sister, Charlotte, naturally experienced profound grief, anxiety, and anguish about Emily's ill health, and it's, of course, only natural that she would want to care for her. In fact, she writes these words to William Smith Williams. She says, "We naturally wish to procure aid for those we love when we see them suffer." But the letters really generate as many questions about this sibling bond as they do the immediacy of this medical situation. Why does Emily Bronte refuse to speak to Charlotte about her illness? Why is Emily so resistant to all the remedies for what Charlotte initially describes as a cough and a cold and then describes as an inflammation of the lungs? And why does Emily view all of these alternative medicines so unfavourably? There are no available answers to any of these questions, but it's striking that when you look through the history of writing on this matter, many scholars and biographers have assumed hostility, ignorance, or worse on Emily's part. So looking again at some of this, I want to challenge a little bit of that. And again, to foreground the fact that this is a young woman who is in her 30th year, and that medical book that I showed you, Patrick Bronte's copy of Modern Medicine, indicates the stages of the disease. And we know that Emily has refused to see a doctor, as I've documented already. And we know from historical records that Charlotte's likely to have consulted the book. But it's also reasonable to assume that Emily did too. And if she had read that book and had looked at her own systems, many of which aren't recorded in the letters, so there's no discussion in these letters of coughing blood, for example. But if she did make the connection between her symptoms and tuberculosis, which I think she probably did, it's highly likely that she would have understood her prognosis. And in fact, in that light, Emily's refusal of aid might appear more logical. If she recognised the unfolding pathophysiology of tuberculosis and its tragic implications, her refusal to give any explanation of her feelings to Charlotte is not only because she's contemplating her own mortality, but she's aware her family have also just experienced another bereavement. They've both just lost a brother. The family is grieving a loss. How does one go and begin to talk about that? The letters also show that Charlotte's reasoning for why Emily won't discuss things with her is something she lays the blame at Emily's personality. She says that a peculiar reserve of character renders it difficult to draw from her all symptoms of her malady. So it's very clear from that Emily is withholding information. So one of the things I've then been doing is thinking through the sisters' wider bond, their wider history, and thinking about, are there other reasons that we might kind of bring to this discussion to think about, well, why is Emily concerned? Why is she keeping Charlotte at bay, particularly in relation to sickness? And one of the things I want to kind of offer here is the fact that we know from previous behaviour that Charlotte Bronte repeatedly undermined Emily's right to privacy. And I want to suggest that actually that might be the case here. So Charlotte's invasion of Emily's privacy is a repeated pattern of behaviour. And before this incident, there are at least two known other occasions that we can draw on to support this claim. So the first is disclosed by Charlotte herself in a piece she writes after her sister's death, known as the Biographical Notice of Ellis and Acton Bell. And in that, she describes how Emily had been angry when, back in 1845, she had discovered Charlotte had read and accessed her private notebook with all of her poems. And although we have Charlotte to thank, therefore, for the fact that she did that and that produced the poems by Currer, Ellis and Acton Bell, Emily obviously did not like the fact that Charlotte was rooting through her things. In fact, she wrote, "It took her hours to reconcile her to the discovery I'd made." The second known instance when Charlotte undermined Emily's privacy was in relation to the authorial pseudonym that they had used. So Emily had been clear that she didn't want to be forever known like Charlotte, and that she only ever wanted to be known as Ellis Bell. But Charlotte had let the cat out of the bag. And we can see this in a letter to William Smith Williams, when she instructs him in this letter to maintain the ruse of Ellis Bell. And she goes on to write here that he should, when writing, therefore, never allude either to the illness, to the tuberculosis, or to the name Emily Bronte. She says, when you write to me, don't do that. I do not always show her your letters, but I never withhold them when they are inquired for. So we know already during this period that she is betraying Emily's privacy again. And clearly Emily doesn't know this, that Charlotte's already sharing this information about her health during this time. It's pretty likely that she didn't know about this statement to Dr. Eapes, for instance. There's another thing I want to throw in the mix here about why maybe Emily kept her sister at bay. And I want to return just momentarily, therefore, to draw in the Austen letter, Cassandra's letter to Fanny Knight, where Cassandra wrote explicitly that in those last few days, she was by then hopeless of a recovery for her sister. And this issue of hope and recovery is one that I think is critical to understanding this relationship between Charlotte and Emily in this time. So as I've suggested, Emily likely knew she was dying, but Charlotte's letters show that Charlotte alternated frequently between expressions of hope and despair. She writes to George Smith, for instance, that she, quote, "I could speak of my dear sister as a convalescent, but as yet her state only inspires anxiety." Next slide, please. She writes to Ellen, and this is the first bullet point here, "More than once have I been forced boldly to regard the terrible events of her loss as possible and even probable, but nature shrinks from such thoughts. I think Emily seems the nearest thing to my heart in this world." She tells William Smith Williams that she, Charlotte, must cling to the expectation of Emily's recovery. "I cannot renounce it." But 3 days later, she then writes to Dr. Eapes this letter, in which she also then talks about the complexity of hope and fear. Now, several theorists have talked about the idea of optimism and how the idea of optimism can sometimes be cruel and sometimes it can be problematic, especially when it allows an individual to maintain a wish for a future that has no foundation. So with this in mind, Charlotte's repeated questioning of Emily and her relentless recommendation of various remedies maybe imply that she's kind of in denial about her sister's health. Even though she recognises what it is, she's refusing Emily's prognosis. If so, Emily's refusal of aid and her insistence on things remaining as normal, going about her normal business and not wanting to talk about it, is both kind of self-protective for her, but it might also be read compassionately to kind of stop Charlotte's turmoil. This might explain why, as Charlotte said on the 23rd of November, that Emily will scarcely allow her illness to be alluded to, because the more Charlotte speaks or writes of remedies and treatments and seeks them out for her sister, who clearly doesn't want them, the more Charlotte's hope grows. Now, I just want to kind of qualify some of this by indicating that Emily is clearly attentive to the futility of false hope and the inadequacy of Victorian medicine in cases of tuberculosis. And we can look to Wuthering Heights to understand this. There is a scene in that novel in which Hindley is with his wife Frances, who is dying from tuberculosis. And Hindley is angry with Dr. Kenneth and angry that Dr. Kenneth views Frances as near death. He says, "Damn the doctor, Frances is quite right." But Nellie Dean, one of the novel's narrators, offers an alternative assessment. And she sympathizes with Frances, who she describes as a poor soul with a gay heart that never left her. But she also kind of offers a particular commentary on Hindley. And this is what she says. Next slide, please. She notes that Hindley persisted doggedly, nay furiously, in affirming her health improved every day. When Kenneth warned him that his medicines were useless at that stage of the malady, and he needn't put him to further expense by attending her, he retorted, "I know you need not, she's well. She does not want any more attendance from you. She's never in a consumption. It was a fever and it is gone. Her pulse is as slow as mine now, and her cheek as cool." So we see here that reference to a stage of the malady that, again, in her fictional writing, Emily is aware of the stages of tuberculosis. And we see very clearly that Hindley is here in denial. Everyone in the room can read this, that he is investing in false hope, and that really medicine is useless at this point. Nellie's comment makes it clear that sentimentality and medicine are not going to help Frances recover in any way. So this might be one of the reasons why there is this situation between Charlotte and Emily in real life. Next slide, please. So the complexity of the siblings' interactions is also evident in Charlotte's other comments on hope and in what Deborah Lutz has described as Charlotte's need for intimacy. And this letter from the 7th of December to William Smith Williams captures something of that. She wrote, "I can give no favourable report of Emily's state. My father is very despondent about her. Anne and I cherish hope as well we can, but her appearance and her symptoms tend to crush that feeling. Yet I argue that the present emaciation, cough, weakness, shortness of breath are the results of inflammation now, I trust, subsided, and that with time these ailments will gradually leave her." But my father shakes his head and speaks of others of our family, once similarly afflicted, for whom he likewise persisted in hoping against hope. So this letter is important because, as I've said, it shows that Charlotte is thinking, Emily's going to get better. These things might go away. It shows also that there's this debate in the family, that with different positions been taken towards Emily's prognosis. And Charlotte are on one side, taking a kind of more optimistic view to Patrick Bronte, their father, who is shaking his head, reluctant to have any hope. Now, this is really important because it challenges a number of things that have been written about this and about Emily. One of the things that's been written is that she didn't understand she was ill. She didn't understand that she was in the family, that she was in the final stages of consumption, and also that the family perhaps didn't know that she was that ill as well. And this clearly shows that's not to be the case, because she's clearly very, very sick. And the family know that. And this comment implies that there is this debate around false hope implicitly taking place. Sadly, if Emily was refusing to speak to Charlotte to limit her investment in hope or false hope, it actually had the reverse effect, because Charlotte actually wrote that a certain harshness in Emily's power and peculiar character only make me cling to her more. Next slide, please. So, in the days before her death, Charlotte read several books to Emily, and she records her falling asleep as she read them. We know that she brought lavender to her from the moors, and that Emily didn't recognise the lavender. And so it came to be that on the 19th of December, Emily Bronte died at home at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. We don't know where. It said it might have been in the dining room, which is the room on the bottom left here, but there's no evidence. No document actually says exactly where she died. Charlotte's letters affirm the devastation she experienced in the immediate aftermath of Emily's passing. Next slide, please. In a letter on Christmas Day, the rawness of her grief seeps through her prose. She writes, "Emily is nowhere now. Her wasted mortal remains are taken out of the house. Well, the loss is ours. I will not ask now why Emily was taken from us in the fullness of our attachment, rooted up in the prime of her own days, in the promise of her powers, why her existence now lies like a field of green corn trodden down, like a tree in full bearing, struck at the root. I will only say, sweet is rest after labour and calm after tempest, and repeat again and again that Emily knows that now." In her pain, Charlotte sentimentalizes Emily and conceptualizes her death through metaphor. This was clearly a traumatic moment for the elder sibling, in the same way that we saw Cassandra write in to Fanny Knight about her loss. But it also doesn't go to stop Charlotte from going on to misrepresent some of Emily's final months more widely. One of the things she goes on to do is to misrepresent Emily's final words. Her poem, No Coward Soul Is Mine, she writes and publishes as Emily's last poem, when we know that that definitely wasn't the case, that it was written several years earlier in 1846. Nonetheless, from this place of devastation that she clearly felt, Charlotte continued to use words to memorialize her sister. And she actually wrote a poem for Emily that's entitled On the Death of Emily Jane Bronte. And Charlotte's poems are often overlooked and neglected, but this one I think is really, really poignant. Next slide, please. So this is the poem on the death of Emily Jane Bronte. My darling, thou wilt never know the grinding agony of woe that we have borne for thee. Thus may we consolation tear even from the depths of our despair and waste in misery. The nightly anguish thou art spared when all the crushing truth is bared to the awakening mind, when the galled heart is pierced with grief, till widely it implores relief, but small relief can find. Nor know'st thou what it is to lie, looking forth with streaming eye on life's lone wilderness. Weary, weary, dark and drear, how shall I the journey bear, the burden and distress? Then since thou art spared such pain, we will not wish thee here again. He that lives must mourn. God help us through our misery, and give us rest and joy with thee when we reach our bourne. So Charlotte wrote this on the 24th of December, 1848. We can see the passion and the love that she feels for her sister, beginning with the address, my darling. This is spoken initially to Emily, and it's about Emily, but then it's also about the collective we, the family, those left behind. It's a poem that mixes love and grief and loss, touches on the loneliness we all feel after major close grief, touches on the physicality of crying, the reference to the streaming eye, and it's reflective about how to cope with the intensity of loss too. But it's also, in that final stanza, a poem that's grateful for an end to suffering and a plea to God for mercy, that the family, that these individuals will be reunited. Now, Charlotte also wrote that labour, quote, is the only radical cure for rooted sorrow. And she declared that my work is my best companion. Hereafter I look for no great earthly comfort. And the labour that she turned to was her second novel, Shirley. Next slide, please. So the difficult second novel, Shirley, which occupies an unusual space in studies of Charlotte Bronte's work. It is, as has been written, unquestionably Charlotte's most undervalued, underread, most disliked novel. It's often a product, a kind of either a love or a hate. There seems to be no kind of middle ground with Shirley. I really, really love and admire this book, but I know it's not Jane Eyre for many. Now, what's interesting about Shirley is that Charlotte began the first two volumes of this book early in 1848, and she was progressing well with it until the bleak period from September 1848 until May 1849, when the sisters Branwell and then Emily and Anne became ill and died one after the other. So she put the book down in September 1848, and she picks it up again in June 1849 after Anne has died in the May. And she began the book again with the section in volume 3 that's entitled The Valley of the Shadow of Death. Now, critical reception of Shirley was mixed when it was published in the October of 1849, so it came out really, really, really quickly. To many, it bore the stamp of genius, and some reviewers assured readers that they wouldn't be disappointed by Currer Bell's second titles. To others, it was superior to Jane Eyre, but for many, they felt that there was a problem with Shirley and that it was flawed. Next slide, please. And probably the person that encouraged Charlotte Bronte to read and admire Jane Austen was the person that was most critical about Shirley. And I won't read this entire quote to you, but the first couple of lines are, you can see he's drawing a connection to the difference between Shirley and Jane Eyre. He says, the unity of Jane Eyre, in spite of its clumsy and improbable contrivances, was great and effective. But in Shirley, all unity, in consequence of defective art, is wanting. There's no passionate link, nor is there any artistic fusion or intergrowth by which one part evolves itself from another. And he goes on to say that the book may be laid down at any chapter, and almost any chapter might be omitted. It's not a picture, but a portfolio of random sketches. And I think that's a really interesting observation, that it's kind of disjointed in some way. Because as I've said, Charlotte is writing this across this devastating period of loss for her. But the other thing that's really important about Shirley is that even though it's not a biofiction, it's really informed by her sisters. And the titular character of Shirley Kielder, next slide please, is said to be inspired by Emily Bronte. And we know this, or rather that only became known in the 1850s, so long after the book had been published. And we know it because Elizabeth Gaskell wrote about that in her biography in The Life of Charlotte Bronte, where she says that Charlotte had told her that the character of Shirley herself was Charlotte's representation of Emily, but that Charlotte had tried to depict her character in Shirley Kielder as what Emily Bronte would have been had she been placed in health and prosperity. So it's got a lot of elements of Emily, but in health. And so it's almost in some ways a kind of a rewriting of those final months that she'd experienced with her sister, watching her become very, very ill and dying. Now, scholars have been divided on the extent to which this is true. Some have seen that this could be therefore read as a kind of elegy for Emily. And for me, I think that's certainly the way I read it. Next slide, please. And many of the aspects of Shirley's character reflect elements of Emily's her personality, but also incidents from her life. So, for example, the two both love the moors. We see that Shirley is incredibly stoic in the face of pain. Like Emily, Shirley is feminine and masculine concurrently, because Emily was nicknamed the Major in real life, and Shirley is known as Captain Kielder Esquire, which also echoes Emily's pseudonym, Ellis Bell Esquire, of course. Shirley, like Emily, was able to handle and operate pistols. She was taught by her father, the Reverend Patrick Bronte, to do so. Shirley's dog Tartar is based on Emily's dog Keeper, and this is Keeper here on the left. That's Emily's painting of Keeper from life, in fact. And there's incidents that have been written about Emily and Keeper where she would notoriously break up dog fights through the use of pepper, and he was known to get into scuffs, and that's recreated in Shirley, including a moment when, again, Emily Bronte had to cauterize or self-cauterized herself after experiencing a dog bite, and that's again put into the novel. So, but as much as Keeper had fights, he also, again, we're told he used to curl up around Emily as she read, which is something that Tartar also does with Shirley Kielder in Charlotte's novel. And what's interesting is that in her study of Emily in this book, Charlotte uses the word weathering. Again, it appears in chapter 5 of volume 3, so that one that's about the Valley of Shadow of Death. And it happens where, again, they're talking about the weather. And Charlotte would again use the word weathering in Villette. And again, I think that because it doesn't really appear as a word elsewhere in English language, and it's often said that Wuthering Heights is the first known origin point for that I think that's a kind of tribute to Emily as well. So why is this important? Well, we know that in the publicity in the aftermath of Anne and Emily's death, that Charlotte, as I've said, wrote the biographical notice of Ellis and Acton Bell. And although it's long been characterised as a means to defend her sister's literary reputation against the accusations of coarseness, she set up a series of contradictory ideas about who her sisters were. In Emily's case, Charlotte wrote that figures like Heathcliff maybe hadn't been a good idea, that Emily was rustic, unworldly, and knotty as a root of heath, and that she hadn't really known what she was doing when she was writing Wuthering Heights. The long-term effects of that next slide please, have been that biographers from Elizabeth Gaskell onward have begun to paint quite a negative picture of Emily. And the life of Charlotte Bronte, written by Elizabeth Gaskell, is really, really quite cruel to Emily. And this is something that Gaskell wrote. She said, you know, she'd never met her. Emily was long dead by the time Gaskell was writing it. But she said, all that I, a stranger, have been able to learn about her has not tended to give either me or my readers, a pleasant impression of her. I'm always really surprised when I read that line, that she assumes that her readers will have the same view. So Gaskell's view of Emily Emily was stubborn and persistent, particularly in those final months. But actually, I think that if Charlotte Bronte had been around to understand how Gaskell had actually written about her sister, I don't think she'd have been that happy. And if we look at a letter that Charlotte wrote several years earlier, next slide, please, we can see that she was really kind of, you know, sisterly bonds were really important to her. She wrote, "The value of sisters' affections, there is nothing like it in this world." And she wrote that to Margaret Wooler, her friend, in relation to Emily. Now, I mentioned earlier that when Anne died a few months after Charlotte, but one of the things that I guess is incredibly painful about that is an understanding that Charlotte clearly experienced the grief of her sisters very differently. Next slide, please. And this is one of the things that she said. She wrote that into William Smith Williams that she could let Anne go to God and felt he had a right to her. "I could hardly let Emily go. I wanted to hold her back then, and I want her back hourly now." So this is a kind of incredibly difficult situation for her. And it's almost impossible when I look at these letters to kind of imagine the kind of difficulty that Charlotte Bronte must have been experiencing during this time. But I think through her writing, through Shirley paying tribute to Emily, through that poem, and through these letters, she was able to continually celebrate her sister. And clearly sisterhood was incredibly important to her. So I want to end on just a very final quote that really contextualizes Charlotte Bronte and her feeling towards family and home and to her sisters. Next slide, please. And this is what she said. She said, "My home is humble and unattractive to strangers, but to me it contains what I shall find nowhere else in the world. The profound and intense affection which brothers and sisters feel for each other when their castes are in the same mould, their ideas drawn from the same source, when they have clung to each other from childhood, and when family disputes have never sprung up to divide them." Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Claire. That was very moving.
Thank you.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, it's hard even to talk about it very rationally. I guess, you know, what I was thinking about a lot of the time as you were talking was and anybody who's been a caregiver or who has been involved with other caregivers has probably had this experience, just the kind of emotional difficulty, because the caregiver is in some ways the one who is feeling the responsibility, you know, and trying to control things. And then, you know, the danger there, of course, is what you're pointing out that happens, is that the person being cared for can often feel this sense of, you know, being overwhelmed by it and this desire to push back. And so that sense of control, I think, that you see Charlotte trying to exert and not being able to exert is really fascinating here. And is part of the poignancy of what you're talking about.
Yeah, it's really interesting that just after this period, when Anne begins to get sick, and Anne begins to show symptoms of TB in that December, right in the week before Emily dies, you can see that Charlotte is incredibly jaded, but again begins to go back through the same process of hope to despair in her letters, but she's far more guarded and far more critical of Anne, partly because Anne takes the complete opposite view to Emily. Anne embraces all kinds of treatments and is very proactive in what she's doing, to the point that Charlotte's kind of standing by and saying, well, no, I don't think you should do that. I don't think you should do that. That's not going to work. So it's a very different dynamic, but I think it captures exactly what you've said, that helplessness. Charlotte is a bystander, and it must have been incredibly traumatic for her. When she was a kid, she'd lost her 2 older sisters, as they all had. And her mother in close succession. And then all these years later in life, she's having another cycle of 3 deaths. I mean, it must have been an enormous kind of trigger for her to have that kind of intensity of grief back in her life, and now to be re-experiencing it and as an adult, and not having sufficient medical treatments. I mean, there was nothing. I think she had hope and investment in the efficacy of the treatments that were available, but I don't think Emily did, and I think that's partly why Emily was refusing things. But yeah, it's incredibly. I find it very difficult, even when I've worked on these letters so often, to think just about how awful it must have been for Charlotte to be the last one standing. To go from one of 6 siblings and then to just have watched them all go. It's unfathomable.
Well, yeah, and then when you think about this radically compressed period of time where first Branwell goes and then Emily goes, how can she start again with Anne?
Yeah.
And you can just see that she may not even have had the emotional headspace to start dealing with that,
Yeah, and I think that's also reflected in the fact that, as we know, she put the writing of that novel aside, that she clearly didn't have the headspace to even use creativity as an escapism at that point. She is consumed by the grief, the funerals, the writing to doctors, all of this kind of running around that she's doing. She must have been incredibly fueled with anxiety throughout the whole period, as you'd expect. And yeah, for me, it was actually interesting. I started working on the Brontes in sickness back before COVID, and I found that the experience of COVID made me think differently about this, partly because it was obviously connected to lungs. It was invisible in the same way it would have been, but also just that idea that we were looking around and seeing a lot of loss, a lot of grief, and being helpless bystanders a lot of the times. It was a real kind of, it really brought home to me the reality of what it might have been like for the Victorians, I guess, and for this family in this compressed time, and in this kind of context where medicine is really struggling.
Yeah, both the story of Charlotte's sort of engagement with Emily's illness and then this discussion makes me think that this complicates the idea of violating patient confidentiality or violating her privacy, because, not to say that she's justified in revealing this. I think it's drawing attention how nuanced and complicated these questions are, because clearly Charlotte needs community too. She needs support in this role as caregiver. And if COVID underscored anything, it's that when you're isolated and unable to kind of rely on your usual networks, it can make these experiences of illness just that much more challenging and emotionally, harrowing. And so I and you know so much more about the nuances of this particular dynamic between Charlotte and Emily, but you have to feel like some of these letters are an attempt to speak her own kind of experience and pain as she's dealing with this.
Oh, entirely. And I think we can see that in just the fact that she's writing about this to these different recipients. I think you can, it's a working through. She's obviously updating people, and letters are great for this because they often begin with people declaring how everyone is in the family, how they're all doing. But it means that most of those letters often begin with a very painful declaration of, yes, there's no progress. Emily's still ill, Anne's now ill. And it's, you can see that it is a it's a kind of coping mechanism, but it is that, as you've just said, that kind of need for some kind of community. She is using people. She hasn't got WhatsApp or anything else to be connecting to people. So letters become even more important, which is why that kind of, they are as I've said, for me, thinking about them as more than correspondence, they are kind of narratives of pain for Charlotte Bronte, and a working through of that is a kind of way to see them, I think.
I found it so moving the way you described the echoes of Emily in Shirley and so forth. I'm wondering, just taking it from the other direction, are there, in terms of scenes of loss and grief in their novels, are there ways of, I don't know, that the sisters foreshadow their own responses to grief? Because I kept thinking of Jane Eyre and Helen Burns as you were speaking, in this kind of this very sentimentalized, romanticized lying together with closure and waking up with one body dead.
And that, of course, comes from her own experience, doesn't it? That's kind of, the school is based on Charlotte's experience and that loss of her older sisters. And in a way, I think there's very much that scene, which again is from a child's perspective, but it's been written by an adult, kind of shows the disjoint, I think, between a child experiencing grief, which Charlotte obviously did when she was younger, and then the adult experiencing grief, and how complicated it is, because we read that scene knowing that they're children and that Jane she wakes up and doesn't really understand, does she? But I also think there's an idealization there. I mean, Helen is very compliant and is also willing, isn't she? She understands her own situation, and clearly, as an adult, that doesn't happen with Emily, but it does happen with Anne. They are clearly communicating and talking. There are doctors coming in. They are doing all the things, but it's not idealized. When Charlotte goes to Scarborough with Anne, she's not hopeful that this is going to work out well. She makes some comments that she hopes it might do some good, but give her a little bit more time. But I don't think she thinks that it's going to have any long-lasting effect. Whereas I think Anne is actually more hopeful that she's doing everything she can and she's listening to all her doctors. But I found it interesting looking at the kind of correlation between some of Cassandra's writing and just some of those echoes. It just really jumped out at me.
Thank you.
It's interesting, the scene you brought up from Wuthering Heights, or the episode with Hindley and Frances, that Emily seems to have had a different understanding of death and how the people involved are thinking about it, and how they can take it in or not.
Yeah.
And maybe even, could you also see that in Catherine Earnshaw's death too?
Yeah, I think very much. I think very much so. You can see the complexity around sickness and understanding, and again, what it means to be very close to a situation when you're there. I guess it's interesting with Catherine's death is that Heathcliff's the one outside, as the bystander, he's the one that's waiting and completely helpless in the situation, and is very much removed from the immediacy. And Nellie's in this odd position, isn't she, of kind of nursing her in some way. But I find it interesting that when kind of taking a step out of the fiction and thinking about Emily constructing those scenes, it does give us a lot of insight into her understanding of sickness and her understanding of particular illnesses. And that quote I read when I was re-looking at that scene, I think it just, the fact that she's talking about the stages of the disease made me really understand that she genuinely understood tuberculosis as much as anybody else. And if she was writing that several years before she had it herself, it makes logical sense that she knew what was happening.
Yeah.
Was there this question from Alice here? In the 1840s, was TB not known to be infectious or contagious? What kind of illness was it thought to be?
Well, so it's a really, really good question. Thank you, Alice. So TB is seen in multiple different ways. There's been some wonderful writing about how it's connected, particularly through Romanticism, to ideas of kind of elitism and linked to intellectuals in some way. And then it's almost chic. Charlotte Bronte actually writes about that. She says she's aware that tuberculosis is meant to be a flattering malady, she calls it. But from a medical perspective, one of the complications of the history of medicine looking at this are the mixed views about tuberculosis at this time. So it's not until later in the century that we really get an understanding of germ theory, that we really get an understanding of the cause of tuberculosis. So at this time, they're not aware of how it is being spread. There is concern about bad air, miasmus, and we know that when in the parsonage, when Anne is sick, her and Charlotte take separate rooms, but that's also to kind of keep the temperature in Anne's room at a particular constant. And doctors are are in conflict at this time about the causes of tuberculosis and, more importantly, about the treatments. So again, you see different doctors, some thinking that it can be cured, some thinking and not really even being clear what a cure is, and some seeing it as not something that can be overcome. And I think that kind of that debate, the fact that they're having that debate, is indicative of the state of medicine at that time and the treatments. I mean, probably one of the biggest treatments, apart from going to spas and taking the waters and benefiting off the air, was cod liver oil, basically, which was marked as the cure for all things, was seen as one of the most beneficial medicines. I mean, we wouldn't dream today of giving cod liver oil as a treatment for such a serious illness, but I think it kind of shows us how very differently the disease was looked at back in the 1840s.
Just a quick follow-up on that. What was the mortality rate? Because Charlotte had it as well, right? But what actually recovered?
It's not actually clear with Charlotte. So the mortality rate is really, really high. It rises at this point in the mid-century, but that's across Europe. But in Haworth, in around this time, the average life expectancy for a whole range of illnesses, so including whooping cough and things like that, is 25 years old. You were lucky to get past the age of 6, and if you did, 25 was your life expectancy. So by that local stat, actually the Brontes did really, really well. But of course, Haworth was a particularly sick area. There were a lot of deaths, a lot of unknown deaths, really poor conditions, poor sanitary conditions, overcrowding, the water was contaminated. So a lot of problems that would have led to a lot of diseases and brought that life expectancy down, before you add in contagious diseases like tuberculosis.
Do you think that Charlotte was also looking at these 3 siblings dying and seeing her own probably imminent death or contracting of the disease? Is there any sense of that?
It's a really interesting question. I don't think she was thinking necessarily of her own death. I think she was acutely aware of her own isolation and acutely aware of that loss. I mean, it clearly changed her entire world. When she becomes friends with Elizabeth Gaskell later, and Gaskell goes to stay with her, Gaskell also ends up kind of sitting with her of an evening, and Charlotte talks about the sisters walking around that table. So I think that reminder, that absence, that gap was always kind of in Charlotte's mind. But I think after this horrible period, of course, she goes on to ultimately, a few years later, to find a form of happiness with her husband, gets married and begins, even though it's a short life, she did live a kind of happy life towards the end. So I think she probably lost not got over it, but certainly lost any anxiety and acute awareness. She was very attached to her family, obviously, because she always stayed with her father as well.
Sort of returning to this question of Charlotte's influence or potential control with respect to Emily's illness, we have two kind of related questions. One from Mimi, I'll show first, which is asking about sibling order, birth order, as a contributing factor. And then I think a very related question is from Claudia, which is interested in whether there's been any scholarship about Charlotte as a quasi-parental figure in this sibling group.
Thank you. They're both really, really interesting questions. So yeah, I think the sibling order definitely has a lot to do with this situation. You know, Charlotte, when Charlotte lost her mother and then her older two sisters, she de facto became the oldest and would have had a lot of responsibility. And so it's kind of understandable that she took on this very kind of important nurturing role. And we see that even with her as a writer and as an editor. She was often the editor. Her and Branwell worked kind of very collaboratively. And then later, Charlotte was the driving force, you know, in terms of the sisters and their literary career. So I think she took on that quasi-parental role in many ways. But in terms of, there isn't much in terms of how that manifests with Branwell. Actually, we know that they had a tense relationship, again in literary terms, and that they kind of separated. And there's an interesting gender dynamic there, obviously him being the only boy in the family, but that seems to be much more of a clash. There has been a lot of work in relation to her kind of, I guess, that role in relation to Anne, and I guess the legacy of that with Anne. And that'll be an interesting question to pick up with Maria Frawley when she's on in a few weeks, who wrote a brilliant book on Anne Bronte, of course, because Anne is often infantilized in so many ways. She is the baby of the family in age, but she's also seen as the kind of the forgotten one, the lesser Bronte. And even just in one of those quotes I read to you at the end, you can see this kind of difference in how Charlotte's treating Anne. But there's more to be said, I think, there about that kind of role and responsibility, and how that kind of would have shaped Charlotte as well. I think it's understandable that she took on that kind of authority role from a young age. She was the oldest, so.
As a follow-up,
go ahead.
Can I ask a follow-up? Yeah. Was Charlotte also the caregiver for Branwell?
No. Charlotte had quite a tense relationship with Branwell, particularly to the end. Emily was more of the caregiver to Branwell. Charlotte and Branwell were, there was a lot of shame brought to the family, obviously, by Branwell's indiscretions with the Robinsons. And in the letters, you can see that Charlotte had been very angry, and then in the immediacy of his death, she's left with the complexity of that anger and how it kind of evaporates in the face of death. And she's left with then the void, and not so much guilt, but the unresolved nature of that relationship, the kind of feeling of hope of her brother being lost, and been lost in more ways than just through death. I think that his alcohol misuse, his drug misuse, and that shame he brought to the family, that she'd been very angry with him and almost kind of emotionally closed herself off to him. But Emily and Branwell were very, very close, and she obviously had played a very important part in Branwell's final months, to the point that that's often one of the reasons why people kind of say that she got ill. And again, it's one of the reasons why people have said Branwell must have also died from tuberculosis as well.
I keep thinking about the line in Mansfield Park about even the conjugal tie is beneath the fraternal. The poignancy of these brotherly and sisterly relationships. But returning to Cassandra for a moment, we have a question from Mimi. Did Charlotte's handling of her sister's legacies mirror Cassandra's? Cassandra, of course, burnt so many of Jane Austen's. She curated Jane Austen's legacy very carefully. maybe you could tell us a little bit about how Charlotte did so as well.
Yeah, there's one of the biggest myths, I think, is that yeah, Charlotte also burned lots of things left by Emily, but there's actually no historical evidence that she did that at all. We know that she obviously preserved a lot, and she immediately in 1850 went into the role of editor of her sister's surviving papers. She writes about trying to find all of the things they've gone, and she puts together and curates what she calls the literary remains of Ellis and Acton Bell. But what she does in terms of destruction, rather than burning, is the editing that she does of that work. So she edits. I mentioned the poem "No Coward Soul Is Mine." She changes dates, she adds titles, she changes punctuation, she reorders things entirely, she takes out whole sections, and she does that extensively to both Emily and Anne's work, such that you can Google certain poems now that are said to be by Emily Bronte, and they're not. They're Charlotte's version of Emily's poem. Emily's manuscripts are different, so beware where you get your Bronte poetry from, that you're getting the actual version. But she does that, and so she's got a kind of interesting, different mode of I guess, destruction in that way. But at the same time, she is also, we have her to thank for that, because in publishing those literary remains and giving us the kind of biographical preface, she republishes a new edition of Wuthering Heights and Agnes Grey with a new editor's preface. She sustains her sister's legacy. You know, they had been seen as coarse and vulgar, and she is determined to keep their name as literary figures. She has a complex relationship to Anne's work. She doesn't want to authorise the republication of Anne's second novel, The Tenant of Waltham Hall, which she says is an entire mistake. So she censors things. But yeah, there's no evidence of the burning that often is attributed to her. But I think it's interesting that in Cassandra's case, that she does very quickly get into the handling of those manuscripts and seeing things come to fruition and keeping things. And there's definitely a parallel there, I think, between Charlotte and Cassandra as well, which probably warrants more exploration, actually.
There's another question here on the documentation. Kitty says that she's read that Arthur Bell Nichols gave away some of Charlotte's writings. Have those been discovered, or have you used any of these in this presentation?
So I haven't used anything by Arthur in this presentation. Arthur was incredibly protective of Charlotte and Charlotte's writings, and didn't want to be sharing anything, and was kind of slightly conned into giving certain things over to Elizabeth Gaskell. But we also have to thank Arthur Bell Nichols for keeping a lot of the images and a lot of the material things that survive now. So the only portrait that we've really got of the family, the pillar portrait, the one that I had on the slides, is and the folds in it are because Arthur kept that image, folded it up and put it on top of a wardrobe and took it back to Ireland with him. We have him to thank for preserving lots of that kind of original manuscripts. The letters, though, those are preserved mainly because of friends, because of Ellen Nussey in the main, Charlotte's kind of great friend. So Arthur was very protective, and he didn't want to be really giving away some of Charlotte's things, and that's partly because he understood that Currer Bell was a celebrity. People were already arriving here in Haworth, wanting to get signatures, wanting to see where she lived, wanting to find out more about her, and that only ever increased after she died. So he was trying to keep things and to stop that kind of pillaging of the sisters' remains. So he was kind of more of a protector for her, which I think is kind of really respectful. You could tell, I think, that he loved her very much. And I should say that the only thing I will say about him as well is one of the things that connects Charlotte with Arthur is Arthur Bell Nichols is the person that presided over Emily's funeral. As that was obviously long before he ever proposed. And of course, Charlotte, he famously proposed and she declined him. But when she did finally accept him and they began that kind of courtship, I'm sure that the fact that he was involved in that would have been a really important bond between them, important mode of connection.
Yeah.
All right, I think one final question, Sarah, do you want to give it?
Sure. Well, I mean, the subject is such that I'm not sure we're going to find a question that's particularly optimistic. But so we do have a question about their mother, which is, I guess, I think a little bit we're wondering if there's a connection between her death and the sibling's death. It seems like there's a lot of similar illnesses going on. You spoke about the kind of the atmosphere of their community and their specific location. I don't know if you can speak to that.
Yeah, so the mother, we believe that she died of probably something that's like uterine cancer, but we don't have a specific cause of death. And that's partly to do with the fact that, again, back in the 19th century, that kind of mode of investigation wasn't as clear. So she died of that. Fast forward into, obviously, we know tuberculosis took those younger children, and it takes out most of the family. With Charlotte's death, it's again unclear. So her cause of death is officially, again, tuberculosis, but there's obviously been a lot of writing on the idea that she had extreme morning sickness, which again has been incredibly disputed because there's no clarity that she was actually pregnant. I guess there is a line of thought in there that would connect her in some way back through her mother, in terms of that kind of reproductive area of the body. But in the absence of actually any firm, concrete evidence, all we have are what's actually written on the death certificates, which is really complicated. So, yeah, there is a connection, but it's not one we could ever prove. Not based on the evidence that we have now, anyway.
Well, thank you so much, Claire. It was a wonderful talk.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me and for all the questions. It's been fantastic.
And thank you to everyone in our audience. Please stick around as we have a little bit more news to share from Jane Austen and Company. I'm going to turn things over to Susan, who has some info about our next event.
Yes, our next event will take place on Tuesday, November 19th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, where we'll get to hear from Deb Barnum. And please note that this event is going to start at our usual time, whatever that is for you. Also, we know that not everyone can afford to support this program, which is exactly why we want to try to keep it free. But if you can afford it, please consider donating at this link now or when you register for our events. It really makes a huge difference. We have been particularly proud of our ability to maintain a pay-what-you-can format because we recognize that not everyone is in that kind of financial position. So we want to keep Jane Austen and Company as widely as available as possible, and donations are really how we're able to do that. Even a few dollars can make a big difference. So thank you for your continued support.
Yes, thank you. And just a reminder, the recording of tonight's presentation will be posted on our website, which is janeaustenandco.org, and to YouTube very soon after we finish tonight. And if you can't wait until our next event, you can view any of our previous programs on that website. And that it contains an archive of all our previous lectures. There's over 40 of them on topics ranging from bookbinding in the Age of Austen, questionable home remedies, which we kind of talked about tonight from the Regency, adaptations in Japan and India, and the unexpected connections between Austen and Byron. And so we've enjoyed bringing you this thought-provoking programming over these past 3 years.
And more, I think.
And more.
Well, thank you, everyone. And thank you again, Claire. This was a lovely event. Goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye.